"Ma'am, this is a six-figure auction, not a bake sale. There's a seat for you in the back if you'd like to watch." Calvin Ashworth's voice rolled across the marble lobby of the old county courthouse annex, smooth and amused, and a ripple of laughter moved through the crowd of men in tailored suits standing in front of him. Loretta Banks did not sit down. She kept the numbered paddle raised exactly where it had been for the last 30 seconds, and she said, evenly, "I'd like my bid recorded, please." Nobody in that room moved. None of them knew who Loretta Banks was. They didn't know what was sitting in the worn leather folder tucked under her arm, or why she'd been standing outside this building since 6 that morning, or what was about to happen to the cracked brass nameplate that, in about 11 minutes, Calvin Ashworth was going to knock off a folding table without ever once looking down to see what it said. By the time the gavel came down for the last time that afternoon, Calvin Ashworth was going to be looking for the nearest exit, and he was going to be looking for it, pale, sweating, and $12 million short of understanding what had just happened to him. Have you ever watched a room full of people decide all at once that someone didn't belong there, and then watched that same room find out, in real time, exactly how wrong they were? Let me take you back. 3 weeks earlier. Loretta Banks's alarm went off at 4:15 every morning, which was earlier than it needed to, and earlier than almost anyone who worked for her would have guessed. She owned 41 grocery stores across 3 states, a company called Banks and Daughters that employed nearly 6,000 people, and, according to a magazine article she had never read past the first paragraph, because her daughter had printed it out and left it on the kitchen counter without comment, a net worth with 8 figures in front of the decimal point. None of that was visible at 4:15 in the morning, when Loretta pulled on the same gray work jacket she'd owned for 9 years and drove. Her own truck, a 2011 Ford with a dent in the tailgate she'd never bothered to fix, to whichever of her 41 stores happened to be having trouble that week. This particular week, it was the store on Caro Street, where a walk-in freezer had failed overnight, and a night manager named Desmond, 22 years old, 3 weeks into the job, terrified he was about to be fired, had called the emergency line at 3 a.m. expecting to get a recording. He got Loretta. She was there by 5, in her work jacket, helping move product into a rented refrigerated truck before it spoiled. And when it was done, she put a hand on Desmond's shoulder and said, "You did exactly the right thing calling. Don't you ever sit on a problem because you're scared of who's going to hear about it? That's how small problems become big ones." Desmond would tell that story for years. He had no idea, that morning, that he was talking to the woman whose name was on the building. That was Loretta Banks. The kind of person who showed up at 5 in the morning in a 9-year-old jacket, and the kind of person almost nobody recognized because she had spent 40 years making sure of it. In her office, a modest room above the company's first store, the one she'd bought with her grandfather's money back, when the company was a single delivery van and a folding card table, there were 2 things on the wall that mattered more to her than anything else in the building. One was a black and white photograph, slightly faded, of a man in a white apron standing in front of a storefront, arms crossed, not smiling, but with something steady and unshakable in the set of his shoulders. Underneath the photograph, in handwriting that wasn't Loretta's, someone had written a date, 1955. The other was a brass plate, about the size of a hardcover book tarnished dark with age. It read, in letters that had once been bright, "Banks Brothers Grocery and Dry Goods, T 1948. There was a long crack running diagonally across it, the kind of crack that happens when something heavy lands on metal that isn't expecting it. The man in the photograph was Loretta's grandfather, Theodore Banks. The brass plate had hung above the door of his store for 20 years on a street that didn't exist anymore. Not really. Not the way it had once existed, a street called Liberty Row, 3 blocks of black-owned grocers, tailors, a barber shop, a pharmacy, and a diner that Theodore used to say served the best coffee in the state. And I'd know, because I drank it every morning for 19 years. Loretta had grown up hearing about Liberty Row the way some people grow up, hearing about a relative who died young, with love, and with a grief that never quite finished happening because it never got to finish in the first place. For the last 6 years, Loretta's company had employed two people whose entire job was real estate. Not buying grocery stores, buying records. Property records, city council minutes, old zoning maps, foreclosure filings, anything that might tell them what had happened, building by building, to the 3 blocks that used to be Liberty Row, and whether any piece of it might ever come back onto the market. 3 weeks before the morning, Calvin Ashworth told her there was a seat for her in the back. One of those 2 employees, a sharp, careful young woman named Renee Okafor, who had been with Loretta for 4 years and had learned, early on, never to call with good news by text, called Loretta directly at 6 in the morning, while Loretta was loading freezer boxes into a truck on Caro Street. "It's up," Renee said. 114 Liberty Row, the whole building. The bank's foreclosing on the holding company that's owned it since the 80s, and it's going to auction in 3 weeks. Public sale, cash or certified funds, same day. Loretta stood very still for a moment, a freezer box in her arms, steam rising off the loading dock into the cold morning air. "That's the address," she said. "It wasn't a question." "That's the address," Renee said. "Loretta, that's your grandfather's building." Loretta set the box down carefully on the dock, the way you set down something you don't trust your hands with anymore. And for a moment, she didn't say anything at all. "Find out who's running the auction," she said finally. It took Renee less than an hour to find out. The auction was being run by Ashworth & Pierce, a firm that had been conducting county property auctions for 60 years, founded by a man whose son now ran it. Calvin Ashworth, 54 years old, a man whose family name had opened enough doors in this city that he had genuinely never had to think about what it felt like for a door not to open. Calvin Ashworth had a reputation, not the kind that made the news, the kind that just sort of existed, the way certain reputations do, passed quietly between people who dealt with him and learned, the hard way, not to bother showing up to one of his auctions unless you looked like you belonged there. More than one small business owner over the years had walked away from an Ashworth & Pierce sale convinced, though none of them could ever quite prove it, that their bids had simply never been heard. Loretta had been outbid before. She knew what that felt like, and she knew the difference between losing fair and being made invisible. Loretta's daughter, Simone, had been the one to leave that magazine on the kitchen counter, and she'd left it open on purpose, to a full-page photo of the Caro Street store with Loretta nowhere in it. Loretta had ducked out of frame the moment she saw the photographer setting up. Simone ran the part of the company nobody outside had ever heard about, the foundation that quietly covered things like a night manager's community college tuition, without him ever being told where the scholarship came from. "You could let people know who you are, Mom," Simone had said more than once. "It wouldn't cost you anything." Loretta's answer was always the same. "It would cost me exactly what it's worth," she'd say, and go back to work. And Simone had long since stopped expecting a different answer because she'd grown up watching her own grandmother give the same answer, in the same voice her whole life. Calvin Ashworth had grown up the opposite way entirely. His father, Walter Ashworth, had founded Ashworth & Pierce 60 years earlier and had spent 5 decades building the kind of reputation that never gets written down anywhere, because it doesn't need to be. The kind where a name, set in the right room, simply makes things move. When Calvin took the firm over 12 years ago, he inherited that name the way some men inherit a house, fully furnished, paid off, requiring nothing of him except that he live in it. It showed in small ways, almost every week. A complaint filed with the county about one of his listings would get reviewed and quietly closed within 48 hours. Faster, county clerks would later admit, than complaints about firms with no Ashworth attached to them. 3 years earlier, a man named Curtis had tried to bid on a small auto shop 2 blocks from where he'd grown up, planning to reopen it for his son. He'd raised his hand 4 times. Each time, Calvin Ashworth had somehow been looking somewhere else, and the shop sold to a developer for less than Curtis's standing bid. When Curtis asked about it afterward, he was told the gavel had already fallen before his hand went up. He drove home, told his wife it must have been bad luck, and never went to another Ashworth & Pierce auction again. He was not the only one. He was just one of 14. What she didn't know. What nobody could have told her 3 weeks out. was that on the day of the auction, the brass plate from her grandfather's store was going to end up on the floor of that marble lobby, cracked clean across, before the bidding on 114 Liberty Row even started, and that by the time it was over, Calvin Ashworth was going to wish, more than he had ever wished for anything in his comfortable door-opened life, that he had simply let her finish her sentence. The morning of the auction, Loretta arrived at the courthouse annex at 7:15, 90 minutes before the doors opened, and stood outside in the cold with her leather folder under her arm, watching the sun come up over a block of buildings she had only ever seen in photographs. 114 Liberty Row didn't look like much anymore. The windows were boarded. The bricks above the old entrance were a slightly different color than the rest of the wall, in a long rectangle, where something had once been bolted on and then taken down. Loretta stood there for a long time, looking at that rectangle, and then she went inside. The registration table was set up just past the metal detectors, manned by a young assistant from Ashworth and Pierce, and, standing nearby checking his watch, Calvin Ashworth himself, a tall man in a navy suit that fit the way suits only fit when someone else picks them. Out for you, with the easy, settled posture of a man who had never once in his life had to wonder whether he'd be taken seriously. "Morning," Loretta said, setting the folder on the table and opening it carefully. Inside, cushioned in a dish towel, was the cracked brass plate, and beside it the framed photograph of Theodore Banks. "I'm registered to bid today. Before things get started, I was hoping there's a building on the docket, 114 Liberty Row, and my grandfather's store used to be there. I just wanted to ask whether anyone might know if the original sign bracket is still on the facade. Above the door, I noticed the brickwork this morning." The assistant looked uncertain, glanced at Calvin. Calvin Ashworth picked up the framed photograph, not roughly, not yet, just quickly, the way a man picks up something that's in his way, and gave it about half a second of his attention. "We're an auction house, ma'am, not a historical society," he said, already setting it back down, except the table's edge was closer than he'd judged, and the frame caught the lip of it and tipped. The glass hit the marble floor and starred into a spiderweb of cracks, right across the photograph of Theodore Banks's face. Loretta didn't move for the photograph, not yet. She reached instead for the dish towel. But Calvin, turning to greet the first of the developers walking through the door, swept his arm back without looking, the way people do when they're making room for someone more important. And the brass plate slid off the edge of the table and hit the marble with a flat, ringing clang that turned heads 20 feet away. It landed face up. Banks Brothers Grocery and Dry Goods, Eastern 1948. The old crack running diagonally across it had a new one now, crossing it, so that the metal looked, for a moment, like a window that had been hit twice. Calvin Ashworth glanced down at it for less than a second. "Watch your step, everyone," he said to the room, not to her. And then he moved on, already shaking hands with a man Loretta recognized from the property listings as Garrett Sterling, of Sterling Crown Properties, the company that had submitted 3 weeks ago a redevelopment proposal for the entire Liberty Row block that involved, on page 4, the word demolition 6 times. Loretta knelt down. She picked up the brass plate first, then the photograph, slid the cracked glass free, and folded it carefully into a napkin so no one would step on the shards, and put everything back in the folder. Her hands did not shake. They had not shaken in a very long time. Across the lobby, a man in his 30s with a press lanyard and a small camera lowered it slightly, having just gotten all of that. The photograph, the plate, the clang, the watch your step, without anyone seeming to notice he'd been filming it all. His name was Marcus Webb, and he'd been working for 8 months on a story about what had happened to Liberty Row in 1968. A story that, until 90 seconds ago, he hadn't realized had a living character in it, standing 6 feet away from him. The auction began at 9. Smaller lots first. 2 parking lots. A vacant office building 2 blocks over. And Loretta sat quietly through all of it, the folder closed on her lap, waiting. Then Calvin Ashworth said, "Lot 14, 114 Liberty Row. Full building, 3 stories. Sold as is, opening bid $200,000. Loretta raised her paddle. "200 from Sterling Crown," Ashworth said, nodding toward Garrett Sterling. "Do I hear 250? Loretta's paddle was still up. Ashworth's eyes passed over her without stopping, the way eyes pass over a chair, a coat rack, a thing that is simply part of the room. 250 sterling crown again, anyone else, 275. Excuse me. It was Renee, 2 rows back, on her feet. Mr. Ashworth, the woman in the gray jacket, has had her paddle up since 200. A few heads turned. Calvin Ashworth looked at Loretta. Really, looked for the first time, and something in his expression settled into the particular kind of polite, weary patience that people reserve for interruptions they've decided, in advance, not to take seriously. "Ma'am, this is a 6-figure auction, not a bake sale," he said, and the room, 80-90 people, mostly men, mostly in suits that fit the way Calvin's did, laughed, not cruelly. Exactly. Just the easy laugh of people who'd already decided how this morning was going to go. "There's a seat for you in the back if you'd like to watch." Loretta did not sit down. She kept the paddle exactly where it was, and she said evenly, into a room that had gone suddenly, strangely quiet, "I'd like my bid recorded, please." Nobody moved. Marcus Webb's camera was already rolling. Go back and watch Calvin Ashworth's face in that moment right after she says it. Not at her, not yet. Watch him glance, just for a half-second, toward Garrett Sterling, like a man checking whether anyone else in the room is going to laugh with him again. Nobody did. Nobody moved. And into that silence, Loretta Banks's mind went somewhere it had been going, in pieces, for most of her life. It went to a summer evening in 1968, to a street 3 blocks long that no longer existed the way it had existed then, and to a man standing in the doorway of his own store, reading a letter from the city for the 3rd time because he kept hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something else. The letter was from the Liberty Row Redevelopment Authority, and it used the word blight 4 times in 2 paragraphs. It informed Theodore Banks that the city had determined his property, along with 60 others on the same 3 blocks, to be necessary for a redevelopment project that would bring. The letter promised new commercial investment and modernized infrastructure to the area. It informed him that the city's appraisal of his building, fixtures, and inventory, 20 years of his life, a building he had bought with money he'd saved working 2 jobs through his 20s, a business that fed 11 families besides his own, came to $4,200. He had 30 days to vacate. Theodore Banks did not have a lawyer, and even if he had, there was a particular kind of letter, in those years, that lawyers in this city did not take cases against. Not because the law didn't allow it, exactly, but because everyone involved understood, without anyone saying so, how those cases tended to go, and how long they tended to take, and what it tended to cost a man to find out. He took the $4,200. The Redevelopment Authority tore down 41 of the 61 buildings on Liberty Row over the following 2 years. Before the funding for new commercial investment quietly dried up, the project was shelved, and the remaining lots, including, by no particular plan, 114 Liberty Row, sat half-finished, then empty, then forgotten, passing from one holding company to another for the next 57 years, a piece of paperwork nobody important enough ever bothered to look at twice. Theodore Banks used part of that $4,200 to buy a used delivery van. The neighborhoods where Liberty Row's families had scattered after 1968, pushed out by the same redevelopment, resettled across the city in pockets that, it turned out, the big grocery chains had no particular interest in building stores near. Didn't have anywhere close by to buy groceries anymore. Theodore Banks started driving that van door to door, the way some men deliver newspapers, except what he delivered was milk, bread, produce, the things a family needs and shouldn't have to take 3 buses to get. He called it Banks Brothers Delivery, even though by then there was only one brother left. He ran it for 19 years. By the time he handed it to Loretta's mother, it was 4 vans and a small warehouse. By the time Loretta took it over, 12 years after that, it was the first Banks and Daughters store, and 40 years after that it was 41 of them. Loretta had stood with her grandfather outside 114 Liberty Row exactly once, when she was 9 years old, 2 years before he died. He'd pointed up at a rectangle of slightly different colored brick above the boarded door, the place where a brass sign used to hang, and he hadn't said much. He never said much about it. What he said that day, standing on a sidewalk that had once been the busiest block he'd ever known, was this: cash is just a number, Lo. What you do with it after, that's the part that lasts. He died believing the block was gone for good, not bitter about it. Exactly. In the way Loretta had come to understand, bitterness wasn't really a thing her grandfather had room for, but with a kind of quiet, permanent absence. The way you carry the loss of a person who's still, technically, alive somewhere, just somewhere you can't reach. Loretta had spent 6 years and an entire department of her company making sure that when 114 Liberty Row finally came back onto the market, if it ever did, she would be standing in the room with everything she needed the moment it did. What Calvin Ashworth did not know, what nobody in that marble lobby knew except Renee, who was sitting 11 feet away with a laptop bag on her lap, was that inside that bag was a cashier's check, certified that morning by the bank 2 blocks away, for an amount that had been calculated, appraised, and triple-checked over the previous 3 weeks to cover the full purchase price of 114 Liberty Row, plus every closing cost, plus a margin generous enough that no number Calvin Ashworth was about to say into that microphone was going to come anywhere close to it. It had been sitting in that bag since 8 o'clock that morning. It had been sitting there through the registration table, through the photograph, through the brass plate hitting the marble floor, through "This is a 6-figure auction, not a bake sale," and the laugh that followed it. 11 minutes from now, Calvin Ashworth was going to ask Loretta Banks how she intended to pay, and he was going to find out that the answer had been sitting 11 feet away from him the entire time in a laptop bag, signed, sealed, and certified for cash. 200 from. Calvin Ashworth glanced down at his clipboard, then back up at Loretta, the polite weariness in his voice not quite as steady as it had been 30 seconds earlier. The lady in gray. 200. Do I hear 225? 225, said Garrett Sterling, not even looking up from his phone. 300, Loretta said. That got his attention. Sterling looked up, smiled the kind of smile that's meant to be reassuring and isn't, and said, "Let's not get carried away. Ma'am, this block's been sitting empty for 50 years. Nobody's going to fault you for letting it go." 350, Loretta said. 400, Sterling said, the smile a little thinner now. 600, Loretta said. A murmur went through the room. Calvin Ashworth's pen had stopped moving on the clipboard. 600,000, from the lady in gray, he said. And for the first time all morning, he said it without anything underneath the words at all. No warmth, no amusement, nothing. Just the number. 800, Sterling said, and this time there was no smile. 1,000,002, Loretta said. The murmur became something closer to silence, the kind of silence that has a sound to it, a held breath spread across 90 people. Garrett Sterling looked down at his phone, typed something, waited, and looked back up. Whatever he'd been waiting for, it hadn't come back the way he wanted. "I think," he said carefully, to the room rather than to Loretta, "we'll let the lady have it." 1,200,000 going once, Calvin Ashworth said. His voice had a strange flatness to it now, like a man reading a sign in a language he was only just realizing he didn't speak as well as he'd thought. Going twice. He looked at Loretta. Really looked, the way he should have looked an hour ago, and something in his face shifted, the first crack of a man beginning dimly to understand that he had badly misjudged the size of the room he was standing in. "Sold," he said, "to the lady in gray for $1,200,000. A ripple of applause started somewhere near the back. Marcus Webb, Loretta would learn later, had started it on purpose and spread, uneven and a little stunned, through the crowd. Calvin Ashworth cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'll need your information for the paperwork, and as a reminder, today's sale terms require certified funds within the hour. A deposit can be arranged if—" "That won't be necessary," Loretta said. Renee was already on her feet, laptop bag open, walking forward. She handed Calvin Ashworth a single envelope. He opened it, the way a man opens an envelope he expects to contain a check for a deposit, a few $1,000, maybe, a good-faith gesture, and pulled out a cashier's check. He read the amount first, $1,200,000, exactly certified that morning. Then his eyes moved up to the name printed beside it, and Calvin Ashworth went very, very still. Loretta Banks, Chief Executive Officer, Banks and Daughters Grocery Group. He had read that name before. 3 months ago, on the cover of the state's largest business journal. Under a headline he remembered now with a kind of sick clarity. The Quiet Fortune. Inside the $1.4 billion company you've never heard of because its founder never wanted you to. His own daughter had a framed copy of that issue in her apartment because she'd done an internship at one of the company's stores the summer before, and she would not stop talking about the woman who'd come in unannounced at 5 in the morning to help fix a broken freezer. Cash. The whole amount. Cash, certified, signed, done. For a building Calvin Ashworth had 90 minutes ago told the owner of not to bother bidding on. The color left his face the way water leaves a drain, not all at once, but completely, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Standing in front of 90 people, holding a check with more zeros on it than he had ever personally seen in one place, signed by a woman he had just spent an entire morning calling ma'am, in a tone he was only now far too late, hearing the way everyone else in that room had heard it the whole time. Miss Banks, he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word. I had no idea, I know, Greta said, calm, even. The same voice she'd used an hour earlier, the same voice she'd used at 5 in the morning on a loading dock with a terrified 22-year-old. She wasn't smiling, but there was nothing cruel in it either, just a kind of tired, settled clarity. The look of someone who had been waiting 57 years for a sentence and had finally gotten to finish it. My grandfather used to own this building, she said. I'd like to take a look at the brickwork above the front door, if that's all right. There's something I came here to check on. Calvin Ashworth, still holding the check in a hand that had not entirely stopped shaking, said, Of course, Miss Banks, whatever you need. Behind him on the marble floor, the cracked brass plate still lay where it had fallen. Banks Brothers Grocery and Dry Goods, EST 1948. And for the first time all morning, Calvin Ashworth looked down and actually read it. Marcus Webb's footage went online that evening, attached to a story he'd been quietly building for 8 months. And it did not take long for the internet to find the part of it that mattered most. It wasn't the bidding war. It wasn't even the check. Although the check got its own slow-motion replay in more than one video, the moment Calvin Ashworth's face changed color frame by frame. What people kept going back to, what got clipped, captioned, and reposted by the millions within 48 hours, was 9 seconds near the beginning, a framed photograph hitting marble, a brass plate clattering across the floor, and a man in a navy suit saying, "Watch your step, everyone," without once looking down. And then, 20 seconds later, the same man's voice, lighter, almost playful. Ma'am, this is a 6-figure auction, not a bake sale. Someone spliced the two clips together, 11 seconds apart in real time, side by side on the screen. They didn't add music. They didn't need to. By the next morning, not a bake sale was trending in 3 states, and underneath nearly every repost was some version of the same comment. People had watched the cracked nameplate land on the floor 100 times before they even knew what it said. Marcus Webb's full story ran 2 days later, and it wasn't really about Calvin Ashworth at all, not at first. It was about Liberty Row. He had spent 8 months in city archives, and what he'd found, once Loretta Banks's name gave the story a face, was a filing cabinet's worth of letters just like the one Theodore Banks had received in 1968. 61 properties condemned. 61 appraisals, almost all of them suspiciously, uniformly low. 41 buildings demolished for a redevelopment project that, according to the city's own records, never broke ground on a single new structure before the funding was quietly reallocated in 1974. Of the 61 families who'd received those letters, Marcus Webb tracked down descendants of 43 of them. 12 still lived in the city. 3 still had the original paperwork, kept in shoeboxes and filing cabinets for 57 years, the way Theodore Banks had kept his. The city council meeting 4 weeks later was the largest in the building's history. People who had never spoken at a council meeting in their lives stood up holding photographs, letters, deeds, the paper trail of 57 years that nobody had ever been asked to produce before, because nobody had ever thought anyone would care. The council didn't vote on anything that night. But 6 weeks after that, it did, unanimously, to establish what the resolution called the Liberty Row Reckoning Commission, with a mandate to review every property seizure connected to the 1968 redevelopment project, identify the original owners or their descendants, and recommend compensation. The first round of recommendations, issued the following spring, totaled just over $11 million across 31 families, an average, the Commission's report noted dryly, of roughly 270 times what each family had originally been paid, adjusted for inflation, and still, several commissioners pointed out, almost certainly less than what the properties would have been worth if they'd simply been allowed to keep them. Ashworth and Pierce did not survive the month the way it had entered it. The Inspector General's office doesn't oversee private auction houses, but the state licensing board does, and within a week of the video going viral, it had received more formal complaints about Calvin Ashworth than it had received about any single auctioneer in the board's 40-year history. 14 of them, from bidders going back as far as 11 years, every one of them describing some version of the same thing. A raised paddle that never seemed to get acknowledged, a bid that somehow never made it onto the record until the bidder simply stopped coming back. 11 of the 14 complaints came from women. 9 came from black bidders. 2 were from a man who had tried, twice, to bid on a small commercial property for his daughter's first business and had been told, both times, that the property had already cleared reserve before his bid was recorded, only for the property to sell, both times, for less than his bid would have been. The licensing board suspended Calvin Ashworth's auctioneer's license, pending a full hearing. 3 months later, the hearing concluded with the license revoked permanently. Ashworth and Pierce, 60 years, 3 generations, closed its doors for good 4 months after that, not because anyone forced it to, but because, as Calvin's own father told a local reporter in what would be his only public comment on the matter, nobody's going to hire a firm whose name is attached to that video. I don't blame them. I watched it too. Garrett Sterling's redevelopment proposal for the rest of the Liberty Row block, the one that used the word demolition 6 times on page 4, was quietly withdrawn 2 weeks after the auction, pending further community input, which everyone understood to mean it was not coming back. Loretta Banks gave exactly one interview about any of it to Marcus Webb because she said he'd earned it, and in that interview she said one thing that ran as a pull quote in nearly every outlet that picked up the story afterward. "People keep asking me how it felt to watch his face change," she said. "Honestly, it didn't feel like much of anything. I've had that feeling, people deciding what I am before I open my mouth, more times than I could count, and after a while, you stop needing it to feel like anything." What felt like something was standing on that sidewalk afterward, looking up at that brick, and knowing my grandfather's building belonged to my grandfather's family again. That's the part that mattered. Everything else was just paperwork that happened to be loud. But there was one more thing that happened in the weeks after the auction that never made it into any article, because Loretta never told a reporter about it, and the only other person who knew was Renee. The morning after the sale closed, Loretta drove to 114 Liberty Row alone before sunrise, the same way she'd driven to Caro Street 3 weeks earlier. She let herself in with the new keys, climbed a set of stairs that hadn't held weight in decades, and stood in front of the boarded window on the second floor, the one Renee's research had found that had once looked out from what was Theodore Banks' small office above the store. She stayed there for almost an hour. Nobody saw her. Nobody photographed it. And when she left something behind on the windowsill where the morning light would hit it first. The cracked brass plate, repaired, welded along both fractures by a metalworker Renee had found. The seams left visible on purpose, sitting exactly where, 57 years and 1 day earlier, it had been taken down for the last time. 1 year later, 114 Liberty Row had a new sign above the door, not the original brass plate, which now hung in a small glass case just inside the entrance, its welded seams catching the light, but a wider hand-painted board that read, Liberty Row Market Hall, underneath, in smaller letters, founded 1948, reopened 2027. The ground floor was a market again. Not a grocery store exactly, but close to one. A dozen small stalls run by independent vendors. Most of them first-generation business owners who paid rent so far below market rate that more than one of them had assumed when they first toured the space that there had to be a catch. There wasn't. The second floor held shared office space, free for the first year, for anyone starting a business in the neighborhood. The third floor, Theodore Banks's old office, the one with the window where the brass plate had spent 57 years, and one night was a small archive and reading room, open to the public, with copies of every document Marcus Webb had pulled out of the city's filing cabinets, available for anyone whose family had once had a building on this block and wanted, finally, to read their own history in a place that wasn't a cardboard box. Loretta Banks came by most Saturdays, usually early, usually in the gray jacket, usually without anyone recognizing her unless they already knew. On one of those Saturdays, a young woman was setting up a stall on the ground floor. Her first day, nervous, double-checking a folding table that wobbled slightly on the old wood floor. Her name was Aisha, and the business was a small bakery, the kind of thing that had once, a long time ago, also had a storefront 3 doors down from where she was standing now, back when the street had a different name and her great-grandmother had run it. Loretta stopped by the table. "First day?" Aisha nodded, too nervous to do much else. "You know whose space this used to be?" Loretta asked, nodding toward the wall behind the stall, where an old photograph, restored now, the cracks gone, though Loretta had kept a copy of the cracked version too, in a drawer at home, because some things you don't want to forget happened, hung next to a small plaque with a name on it that wasn't Aisha's, but might as well have been. "I read about it," Aisha said. "The Banks family. I think my great-grandmother's shop might have been right around here too. I found some papers in the archive upstairs. I haven't had a chance to look through all of it yet." "Take the time," Loretta said. "It'll still be there next week. The bakery's the important thing today." She looked at the wobbling table leg, reached down, and folded a piece of cardboard under it without making it a big deal. "There, try that." Aisha tested it. It held. "Thank you," she said, and then, because something about the woman in the gray jacket seemed familiar in a way she couldn't place, she added, "Sorry, have we met? You seem like you've done this before." "Once or twice," Loretta said, and smiled, and didn't explain, and walked on toward the stairs, because there was a young man on the second floor who'd called the office that morning about a freezer that wasn't holding temperature, and he'd sounded the way Desmond used to sound. 3 weeks before the world found out who Loretta Banks really was, like someone who needed, more than anything else, for somebody to show up. She always showed up. If this story moved you, take a second to like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so more stories like this one find their way to more people. It genuinely makes a difference. And before you go, sit with this for a second. Have you ever been sized up by what you were wearing, what you drove, how you talked, by someone who decided, before you said a word, exactly how much attention you were worth? Here's what really gets me about this one. It's not the check. Checks are just numbers, and numbers on their own don't mean much. What gets me is that the brass plate hit the floor before the bidding even started. Before anyone knew who Loretta Banks was, before there was a single dollar on the table, a man looked at a piece of metal with a family's name on it, decided it didn't matter, and let it fall. And he didn't even bother to look down and see what he'd done. Go back and watch that part again if you don't believe me. He never looks down, not once. Not until the very end, when it was already too late for it to mean anything to him. That's the part of the story that isn't really about money at all. It's about how easy it is to decide, in half a second, that something, or someone, doesn't matter, simply because nobody told you, in advance, that it did. And how often the people making that decision never find out they were wrong. Because the people they're wrong about don't always get the chance, or the cashier's check, to prove it. Most people don't. So here's my question, and I'd really like you to think about it before you scroll past. Is there something about you, your story, your family, where you came from, what you've carried with you your whole life, that you've stopped mentioning, because somewhere along the way, you learned that most people weren't going to ask? And if someone did ask, and really wait for the answer, what would you tell them?